Okay, good afternoon, colleagues. This is the latest in the series of events that we're organizing online as a response to the pandemic, but we find it's been such a good thing to do. We're going to continue doing it afterwards. I'm particularly looking forward to hearing today's talk. The challenge that we're going to be discussing is the safeguarding of information in the nuclear age, particularly for those who produce nuclear waste. It's absolutely vital that we keep a record of everything to do with this technology, the innovations, and all the key decisions that were made in case we have trouble going down the future. Now, in the UK, the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority has begun a very ambitious programme to manage all existing records and information across the UK's civil nuclear industry, with the purpose of creating a records management facility for the industry and an archive for the researchers of the future. The first steps that have been made in that direction have led to a facility being built in Wick, which is way up in the north of Scotland, for those of you who don't know it. And this is Nucleus, the Nuclear and Caithness Archive. This opened in 2017 and has already started receiving records from nuclear sites across the UK, thereby laying the foundations of a digital and paper-based archive for the future. We're privileged this afternoon to be joined by two of the folks from there. That's Chris Sinclair, who's the operations manager at Nucleus, and Gordon Reid, who's the nuclear archivist. And they'll be describing to us the journey that got us to this point, the key challenges that have been overcome, and the lessons learned, and importantly, what the next steps are. Before I hand over the session to them, I think pretty much everybody has already, but could ask you to observe the normal proprieties on these meetings. If you're not actually speaking, please mute. If you have comments that you'd like to add, use the chat facility, and this will be monitored by Christy, and we'll take questions at the end of the session. The session itself, I believe, will be recorded and will be made available afterwards. So having said that, over to our speakers.
Okay, thank you very much, David. I'm just going to start sharing my screen. There, I hope you can all see that now. I can't now see anybody else on the call, so if someone could just let me know if they can see that.
Yes, I can see it perfectly well, thank you.
We can see it.
Perfect, thank you very much. So first of all, I'd like to say thank you very much for the invitation to come and talk to you today. Just by way of introductions, introducing myself and Chris. Chris is the operations manager at Nucleus. So he's got oversight of the entire process of records coming in, how the facility works. And I'm the nuclear archivist, so I have actual day-to-day management of the collections, and I report into Chris. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you an overview of how we got to where we are, some of the thinking involved, and where we go next. And then I'll hand over to Chris, who can talk a little bit more in detail about the building and some of the pros and cons and some of the logistics of getting the records into Nucleus. So I'll just start. I thought I would start, but my screen isn't moving at all. Technical problems are always fantastic, aren't they? So let me try this again. Right, here we go. So a little bit of introduction about the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority, because that has an impact on how we're approaching the records and what it is that we're trying to do. So the NDA is a non-departmental government body. It was established in 2005 under the Energy Act. So it owns and is accountable for the safe and effective decommissioning of all state-owned civil nuclear facilities. So in other words, we're responsible for all of the nuclear sites across the UK, particularly with regard to disposal of nuclear waste, as David mentioned in his introduction. But that's not simply about what you might think of as nuclear processes, but of course it encompasses things like universities and hospitals. So when they use radioactive material in scans, that is all material that will have to be disposed of. So the NDA covers research facilities, fuel production facilities, fuel reprocessing, and Magnox nuclear power stations. And the Magnox power stations, for those who don't know, are the early first generation of nuclear power stations in the UK. They operated without enriched uranium, so they were gradually phased out and replaced by pressurized water reactors in the 60s and 70s and 80s and so on. So this is a map. It gives you an idea of the scale of the operation. So these are all of the nuclear sites across the UK. The blue ones are the Magnox sites, but you can see that there are some 17 sites in total, and they go right from the far north of Scotland right the way down to the south coast of England. So there's a huge logistical challenge involved in just managing the records that we're talking about here. Now, also importantly, the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority is not just about sites where nuclear energy has been produced. There are a whole range of subsidiaries which include radioactive waste management, and we'll come back onto that because waste management is the disposal of nuclear waste, but also things like direct rail services. The nuclear industry has its own rail service for ferrying nuclear material around the country. International Nuclear Services Limited and Pacific Nuclear Transport Limited, there's a picture of one of the ships on the slide, ferry nuclear material around the world. So one of the things that was very interesting, we discovered they keep logbooks, of course, for all of the voyages that are made with nuclear material. So again, these are the kinds of things that will find their way into the archive, but they're not immediately what you think of when you think about nuclear decommissioning. So there's a huge range of material involved here. And this isn't a complete list of all of the subsidiaries, but the one at the bottom, NDA Archives Limited, is the section that has responsibility for the archives itself. So a company has been established by the NDA to actually oversee the archive practices and the building of Nucleus and the long-term information governance program. And again, we'll come on to that in a little bit more detail shortly. So, three main challenges that we face. And it looks very simple and small when you put them on a slide and just make each one into a sentence. But of course, each one of these is a massive challenge for us. So the very first one, processing and managing the existing and growing backlog of paper and digital records. All of those 17 sites have been in existence for quite many decades. The earliest of them go back to the 1940s. So these sites have been generating records. They've been active for 70 years or more. Until the NDA was created in 2005, there was no overarching body that was bringing them all together. And various sites would do different processes, which means that their record keeping would not necessarily overlap. So for example, Magnox sites, they deal with Magnox reactors, so that's straightforward. Dounreay, up in the far north of Scotland, was an experimental station, so it was pioneering fast reactors. Harwell was a research establishment. So there wasn't an overarching, even something like a retention schedule that would bring all of this together. Instead, what you've got is a number of different sites with a number of different approaches with a large backlog of records. So, and that's just the paper. So that's the first issue, is quite simply getting a handle on all of the stuff that's out there. The second one, ensuring that the operational business needs of the industry are met. That's a straightforward records management operation. But of course, with the nuclear industry, there's a particular challenge involved when we talk about semi-current records. And I've been involved in records management for 35 years now, but I tend to think of semi-current as being a few years, a few decades. The nuclear industry's timescales are infinitely greater. So in the first place, there are quite a few classes of records that you might not expect will be kept for a very long time. Things like plans, compliance certificates, photographs of welding joints. Well, of course, Decommissioning means the restoring of nuclear sites to a pristine condition. And in order to do that, and in order to do that safely and effectively, you need to know how the buildings were constructed. So there are a huge number of classes of records which may not be archival, but which we're having to keep for up to 100 years or more, purely so that they can be available for decommissioning when that finally takes place. Waste package records, we'll talk about waste packages shortly, but of course, these are records which will have to be retained for several hundred years as operational records. They've got to be in a condition which means that they can be accessible when they need to be accessed efficiently and effectively. So these are also semi-current records, even if that semi-current requirement is several hundred years. The third category there, the compensation scheme for radiation-linked diseases. Again, medical records would not necessarily, in most organizations, be kept for very long once an employee has left the company. But of course, radiation can be a factor for generations. So under the compensation scheme for radiation-linked diseases, it's not simply medical records that have to be kept. It's also things like logbooks that would record the amount of time an individual spent exposed in a particular radioactive environment. So there are large numbers of classes of records which are having to effectively be put to one side and kept just in case. And again, that is a slightly challenging factor, because of course you tend to assume, you plan ahead on the basis of a throughput of records and a regular culling of some irregular transfer of others to the archive. Whereas we've got quite a lot that are effectively put into hibernation until they are required. And then the last one of those challenges there, and it's one that we're just coming on to now, out of all of these hundreds of thousands of boxes of records, out of all of these thousands upon thousands of legacy data sets, how can we select the ones that are going to be required for posterity, that are going to form the archive for the researchers of the future? So again, until the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority comes under the Public Records Act, which means that there are procedures in place, there are expectations, methodology as to how you assess the records. But until the NDA was created, most of those other sites did not come under the Public Records Act. So they do not have a tradition of assessing records for posterity. Their tradition is purely in terms of operational need. So again, something of a challenge. Records of nuclear waste. I am not an expert in nuclear waste, and probably if there are people watching who are experts in nuclear waste, you should avert your gaze now, because I'm looking at this primarily from the perspective of the records that are required to manage them. And again, this is just something that we're starting to address. So the photograph I've got there, these are drums of intermediate level waste. And this is typically what is thought of as a waste package. And these are drums. They will have material that's contaminated in one way or another. It'll be put inside the drums, and then they will either be sealed with cement or with glass in a vitrification processes to keep it solid. And the expectation is that one day these will be buried deep underground in what is called the Geological Disposal Facility. So this is probably the biggest challenge that we face at Nucleus going forward. So the records that are associated with nuclear waste, there are various ways you can look at them. So this is one way. This is a slide that I've borrowed from the radioactive waste management team. And this shows the nature of the records that could make up a waste package record. So when we talk about waste package records, of course, we're not talking about a document. We're talking about a suite of documents which tell you everything you need to know, starting with how that piece of waste was generated through to how it was packed into the drum and how it was transported to wherever it is currently located. So a huge amount of information which is required, and the nuclear industry is in the process of ensuring that it has all of the correct information that it needs. But the challenge for us is, I'll move on to the next slide. And again, this is just a visualization. First of all, I'm going to apologize that I find it very difficult to draw straight lines in PowerPoint. So if you find some of the lines are a little bit off skew, I do apologize. But this is another way to think about nuclear waste. So at the top, you'll have a particular reactor, and this just happens to be Dounreay down the coast from us, the iconic dome. So over the course of its lifetime, that reactor will be responsible for producing numerous quantities of nuclear waste as a byproduct of its main activities. And this might occur over decades. Each one of those activities, each one of those streams will in turn produce a quantity of waste packages, drums of nuclear waste. So if at some point in the future, somebody wishes to know everything they need to know about the third drum from the left, they not only need to know how it was packed, how it was stored, and what it is, they need to have all of the information about the stream that says this is the way it was produced, this is the environment in which it operated, and these were the regulations and standards that it had to conform to. And it also needs to identify what the reactor was, what the conditions were, how was it actually generated in the first place. So there's a one-to-many relationship all the way down the line. And if you're not careful, you can end up generating thousands and thousands of records for each individual drum. And what we need to get to is a point where we're only keeping one set of information for the stream with a one-to-many relationship to the packages and a one-to-many relationship between the reactor information and the stream information. So a huge challenge involved for the nuclear industry, because Nucleus would be filled up hundreds of times over if we had to keep all of this information for every single package. At the same time, we know that in the future, if somebody needs information on one of those drums, they're going to need it in a hurry. So we don't want to have to be spending a lot of time trying to assemble the components that would make up the original record. So, as I say, quite a challenge. So, one-to-many relationships I've just touched on. One of the other aspects to it, of course, is that all nuclear waste is generated in an environment of regulation and standards. And those standards are constantly being updated. So at what point does your archive become a vast regulatory library with a copy of every single iteration of every single standard or document that it relates to in order to be intelligible in 300 years' time? Because it's no good simply saying this refers to European directive, whatever it may be, if there isn't a copy of that directive somewhere to hand. So again, big consideration. And this last one is probably my favorite thought in the entirety of the nuclear archiving profession, which is that waste package records have to be kept for hundreds or thousands of years. So there's this fundamental question that how intelligible will the records be at that time? In terms of, in Britain, Chaucerian English was probably being used 700 years ago, Norman French, Latin. Again, it's just a fascinating question because these are still going to be operational records in several hundred years. So again, it's just something to think about. I think what I'm saying here is that we may not have answers to a lot of these questions, but at least we're becoming aware of what the questions are. So what we've done is a kind of step-by-step approach to tackle this. So the first step is, how have we gone about managing this? We've established methodologies and standards. We've got rules of engagement. We've built an archive. We've started transferring the collections that are being managed, what are known as the known collections. And we've begun the work on describing, cataloging, and managing the rest of the collections that are out there. And when I say we, I'm referring to the NDA and a whole host of other organizations. I've come into this relatively late, so I don't want to claim credit for things that I haven't done. This has been well thought out for many years in advance. So the first step is the standards and the methodologies. The NDA has a strategy, and part of that is what is known as the information governance strategy. It's updated every 5 years, and there is a program called the Information Governance Program. So I won't read out the statement, and you look at it on the slides. Essentially, what this is, it's looking at the whole aspect of information, knowledge, IT, risk management, intellectual property rights. All of these things come under one section within the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority. And within information management, that's where the archive sits. That's where NDA Archives Limited is based. That's where Nucleus is. And what have they done? Well, the first thing they've done is they've created two key documents. So IMP06 is a metadata standard based on the Dublin Core, but effectively it sets out mandatory and optional fields for describing the records that we're taking in. And everything that we receive into Nucleus, at the moment it's done on a spreadsheet. People will send us spreadsheets, and the spreadsheet is broken down into fields which correspond to IMP06. And we can check that when they come in, and we can make sure that the records are coming to us with the right information. The other document that they've produced is a records retention schedule. So I mentioned at the start that there are lots of different sites that have had lots of different approaches to this. And there are, I think, 7 or 8 different retention schedules across the nuclear industry. So what the NDA has done is they've created an overarching retention schedule into which the others sit. And then over time, we're gradually aligning the other retention schedules with the master. And again, the principle of this is that every record that comes to us must have a code that ties in with the retention schedule, which tells us how long it is kept for, and standard archive practice, what is the recommended disposition at the end of that period. Both of these documents are available on the NDA's website, gov.uk. So if you do a search for the NDA in either of those documents, you will find them. They're publicly available. And again, I can't tell you how helpful it is to have got those documents in place before we started receiving records. We've built an archive. That's a rather lovely picture of the front entrance to the archive in the middle of winter. And Chris will talk a little bit more about the building and how it works. And this is where it is. So as mentioned, Nucleus is in Wick, which is right up in the far north of Scotland. And as the saying is, it's not so much that we're a long way from everywhere else, it's just that everywhere else is a long way from us. It doesn't actually matter. One of the beauties of this, and I think an event like today's is perfectly illustrative of this, we operate a scan-on-demand retrieval service. So it doesn't really matter where we're located, because once we have the records, all they have to do is ask us for them, and we can scan them and email them to them. And again, it's not uncommon. Now that we're here, we can very often give the sites a better service in terms of records management than they had when the records were in a warehouse on the same campus. So actually, the distance is no longer an issue. So where are we? We've started with paper records. We thought we'd deal with the stuff that the biggest problem. So paper records first, before we look at anything else. And we've started with the managed collections. So these are collections that already had a form of records management, that we knew what there was. Several of these sites, such as Harwell and Dounreay, have already been transferred to Nucleus. And we're operating a scan-on-demand retrieval service across the NDA estate. And that's gradually growing as time goes by and we receive more records. Last year, we started putting in place business as usual destructions in accordance with the retention schedule. So these are all the standard things that you would never look to keep in bulk, things like invoices, travel claims, certificates, those sorts of things. So we're starting to get a process of throughput of records. And work has started on cataloguing and assessing the records of the largest and the oldest site across the estate, which is Sellafield. Sellafield is probably about the size of a medium-sized town. It's a vast vast complex, and it's got records of hundreds of thousands of records. So as part of what is known as a sift and lift project, we've started employing a team of people at Wick, and there's another team down near Manchester, and they are effectively cataloguing the records. They're weeding out the ones that are time expired, and then the remainder are being transferred up to Nucleus. And there's something in the region of 70 people employed working on that project just for Sellafield. And we're hoping this is something we can roll out across the rest of the estate. One of the other things that's part of the vision for Nucleus is the hub and spokes model. So the idea is that there are a huge number of other things associated with the nuclear industry, which are not records. So physical objects, and these might be architects' models, or they could be dummy fuel cans, or anything that would be used as anything that's a three-dimensional object. The British Geological Survey is contracted to work with radioactive waste management in looking at suitable sites for the deep disposal of nuclear waste. So core samples and things like that are held by the British Geological Survey. Nucleus is not a film archive, but there are something in the region of 3,000 reel-to-reel films, which have been transferred to the British Film Institute for storage. And then finally, there is, well, this is just an example. There are other kinds of material. Irradiated graphite, for example. So Nucleus will never hold irradiated materials, but it's important to have these things available. So, for example, if a university wishes to do a project on the degradation of brickwork in a nuclear reactor or something like that, that there are samples that are held, which can be retrieved and then can be tested in laboratories. So the idea is not that Nucleus will hold this material, but that Nucleus will be the central hub for all inquiries. We will be the one-stop shop. So if a university is looking for something, if a member of the public is looking for something, they can come to us and we can direct them to where they need to go. We won't be storing the material, but we will be storing the information about the material. So the next steps. We're at the process. Next month, I'm hoping we will actually begin this. We would have started this last year, but unfortunately the pandemic would have shut down all travel. We've established a panel of subject matter experts who are going to start that hugely daunting challenge of sifting through all of the records to determine which ones of those are going to be permanently preserved in the archive. So it's what used to be called under the Public Records Act a second review, but these records can be decades old. They've never gone through this. So essentially the purpose of this is to say anything which is potentially of interest will be evaluated. If it's not going to be kept at Nucleus, but we think it has a local value, it will be offered to a local archive or a local museum to see if they're interested. So this is very exciting because this is the point where records will start to become available for people to see in the public search room. It's the natural endpoint of Nucleus, I think, is that it becomes an archive as the records gradually over time fall away. The Sellafield Sift and Lift project is morphing into a digitization project intended to speed up throughput, save space, and also to save time because a lot of these records would end up being digitized anyway. So again, the SIFT project is becoming a digitization project. I'll say a little bit more of that in a moment. And it's also a means of adding skills to the staff who are involved in that for their future employment. We're developing procedures for digital records. I'll talk about that in a second. We're mapping the metadata requirements for all of these different kinds of objects, artifacts, or histories, whatever they may be. We're mapping them against IMP06 to determine if that's satisfactory. Do we need additional fields? Do we need additional databases? How appropriate is it to use the IMP06 standard for all of these different kinds of materials? Because it was designed for records. And we're also, again, very exciting for us, we're hoping to establish a website which will allow direct public access to all the records which are open, including photographs and other films and clips and material like that. At the moment, we are applying to the government for permission to have a separate website and not to form part of the .gov.uk website. And that's currently ongoing. But one way or another, the vision is that someone will be able to go onto the Nucleus website, search the catalogue, and if they find a record they're interested in, they can just download it, hopefully free at the point of delivery. So, I mean, obviously this will only apply to records that are not sensitive, classified, or secret in any way. But as a vision, I think it's an admirable one. Nearly there. Digital records. So again, we're at the start of making these kinds of decisions. We're having these kinds of discussions. So we're differentiating, obviously, between born digital information, so the material that's in legacy data sets, and digitized records, so where we're taking paper records and turning them into electronic scans, digital copies. The NDA has contracted with the Digital Preservation Coalition to explore and develop solutions. So in other words, we've recognized that there's an expertise there that we need advice on. And we're currently having these conversations with the Digital Preservation Coalition to develop standards. So part of that means standards for digitization in various scenarios. Part of that means, again, seeing to what extent IMP06 gives us all of the metadata fields that we need. Do we need to look at that again? And then we're just at the point where we're beginning to trial solutions for legacy data sets of born digital records. And having been in the profession for some 35 years as an archivist, I can remember for most of my life, this was a problem that was always going to be challenging for future generations of archivists. And I have to say, it's a bit of a shock to discover that I've lived long enough that it's now a current problem. It's not something that's going to happen in the future. It's already happening. This is a challenge we have to face because these are very often data sets that were created back in the 1980s. So again, we are not unique in this. Lots of people all over the world, I'm sure many of the people in your institutions are looking at this too. But it's just, the next phase on where we're looking to move to. And I thought this is just thinking aloud really, but this is some of the scenarios we're looking at in terms of standards for digitization. Because of course, from the outside, the assumption is you can say, right, tell us what the standard should be for digitizing these records. And of course, the answer that comes back is, well, it depends. What do you want to use them for? So we're looking to develop a number of scenarios that will have particular, what resolution do we use? What file format do we use? If we're going to destroy the originals, what resolution scan do we need? If we're going to keep the originals, what should a reference scan look like? And is there a quantity in the middle? Is there a category in the middle which are, we might destroy the originals because they don't necessarily have a high information content now. But if in future it turns out that that changes, do we want to have higher resolution scans available? So these are just some of the conversations that we're having at the moment with a view to firming up a number of use case scenarios. So before I hand over to Chris, I just thought I'd share with you some of the key lessons I think we've learned so far on the project. So, and these are pretty straightforward, I think. I'm sure they'll be familiar to many of you. So I would say, first of all, it has helped us enormously getting our standards agreed and in place right at the beginning, so that everything that comes in matches that standard. Even if the standard changes, the core is still there. So I think that's a fundamental thing. The IMP06, the retention schedules were developed 4 or 5 years before Nucleus, the first brick was laid. Absolutely fundamental, and we are benefiting from that now. Standard project management, everything takes longer than you think it might, than you hope it will. Getting approval, getting a building built, arranging transport, getting destruction signed off, everything just takes a long time, and you just have to accept that. The next point is a very important one, which is the closer the records program aligns with the business needs of the organization, the more successful you're likely to be. So as I say, what problems are you the solution to? The records of nuclear waste, being able to find information about waste package records at some point in the future when you need it, is a fundamental requirement. I can't think of many things that are more important in the records world at the moment. So to have that recognized by the organization, to have that part of the core driver of the organization, has meant that the records program, we're not fighting for resources, we're not fighting to be heard, we're not a nice to have, we're a core part of the business of the NDA. And that's a very gratifying place to be, even though it's, you know, by no means perfect. It does mean that actually you're not having to make the case for archives on a regular basis. It's a no-brainer. Everybody gets it. The last couple of points are, again, very, very obvious. Estimates of the amount of space you'll need and the quantity of records you'll be able to destroy are going to be over-optimistic, and you need to build a bigger archive. Nucleus is already almost full. It opened in 2017 because there are always way more records out there that are harder to get rid of than you think. So yes, I won't say think of a number and double it, but I kind of wish we had. So thank you very much for listening. I'll leave you with a nice picture of the end of the main corridor running through Nucleus. And I'm going to hand over to Chris, who can tell you a little bit more about this astonishing building that we work in. So thank you very much again.
Okay, thanks, Gordon. Just allow me to share my screen as well. Okay, can everybody see that first screen before I start?
Yes.
Yeah, excellent. Okay. So as Gordon explained earlier, my name's Chris Sinclair. So I'm actually the Nucleus Operations Manager. It's a bit of a legacy title. I actually had that title when I was just in charge of a small team within the facility. I subsequently took over the facility in January 2018 and kind of retained the same title. But I'd say I'm more like a site manager. I basically have effective kind of oversight of everything from security through to all operations and even facilities management as well. So today I'm just going to give a brief overview, like Gordon said, about what the facility entails, any trials and tribulations that we've gone through, and just a wee bit more of an explanation of, as he said, what is a fantastic building to work in. So can anybody verify that they can see the next screen? Is that working? Yeah?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. Okay. That's good then. So basically, as Gordon stated, obviously, the primary function of this facility is an archive for the nuclear sector, so the UK civil nuclear industry. The initial proposals it was all geared around being an archive, but I think quite quickly they identified it would have to be dual purpose, and it would be a records management facility as well as an archive because of the semi-current rigor status that a lot of what we take in has. So the early discussions around it started back in around about 2012, I believe, and building work started around about 2015. I personally got involved in the project in August of 2016 when the facility was almost completed and it then opened to the public. Then complete build was in December of 2016. We had a wee bit of finishing touches to add, and then we opened to the public in February of 2017. So the facility, it was actually built by the NDA, and obviously part of that is NDAL, which is NDA Archives Limited. Excuse me. They recognised that they didn't have potentially the scope to manage this themselves, and certainly didn't have the staff numbers to manage this facility themselves. So they went out to tender to get a commercial partner. And so the organisation that I work for, they're actually called Restore Digital. So I report into that organisation, and they're a commercial partner for the NDA, and they manage this facility on their behalf. We've had that contract now since 2015, I believe. So, like I say, the building was opened in 2017, and we were part of the building as well. It's a dual purpose again. It's we open to the public as well as being a secure record store for the civil nuclear sector. So it makes management quite tricky because obviously we've got a secure area storing secure information as well as allowing public access, which is one of the kind of trickier aspects of trying to manage a facility. But I think we manage it quite well. It's not too intrusive on the public when they come in, I feel. So pre-pandemic, as it stays there, we were getting just under 1,000 visitors a year to site. So they're obviously, at the moment, they're all coming in to see the Cadence Archive. So the Cadence Archive basically holds all the records for the county of Caithness, which Wick is situated in. So it's all things like council records, harbour records, just all the legacy stuff dating back to as far as the 1400s. Gordon actually used to manage that archive directly, so he has far more information on it than I do. But I mean, like I said, we get quite a lot of engagement from the public. They come in and they do a lot of family history research and all the rest of it as well. So the pandemic's been a bit of a hit because we've had to close to public. Well, hopefully we're looking forward to getting our doors maybe reopened in 2022. Let's move to the next slide. So back in the early days, there was a lot of designs got banded around for what the facility should look like. Ultimately, this one won out. So this is an early design model from the group of architects that won the final bid. This is actually a very early model that they put forward, and the build has stayed very, very true to this representation. This is pretty much exactly what the facility looks like. It's a long triangular shaped building, and the architects apparently took inspiration from, we've got a nearby airport, which is about 50 meters away from us. So the airfields run in triangular systems. So I think they took inspiration from the design for that. And the three smaller internal triangles you can see on the screen there, these actually have ponds within them. So again, it's to do, they took inspiration from the Caithness countryside, where you've got these this flow country with lots of what are called little loch-ins, which is like small ponds. So they built that and incorporated it into the facility as well. Like I say, obviously it's a secure site. So the public have basically got access to the kind of very front end. I'll show you a picture further on with the corridor, and you can see where the public access terminates. And obviously the whole facility is surrounded by perimeter fencing, and it is very secure access, and it's all alarmed and all the rest of it. So in the early days of the build, obviously there was a lot of pictures taken as it went. So it actually went up really quickly from its start date in 2015 to when I started visiting the site in 2016. It was pretty much a complete building. It went up very fast. What you see on this bottom picture here is one of the pods. So this is actually one of the, we've got 8 repositories on site, and this is one of them getting built here. And it's actually 1 meter steel reinforced concrete for each one. So they're designed to be bomb-proof, explosive-proof, and obviously very resilient. And the added benefit as well, because where we've been built, way up in the north of Scotland, the environmental conditions externally are actually quite good for an archive, because we don't exactly get very warm. So our average temperature is probably ideal for storing an archive. So we actually have power loss. The density of the walls around these repositories allows for quite good temperature management anyway, without even the use of our electronic BMS system, which allows temperature and humidity control. So just another couple of pictures there. You can see the framework going up. The facility was built to exceed British standards, which was PD 5454. That's now been superseded by EN 16893, I believe. So that's an archive standard for basically the build and storage of archive records. I'm sure you guys know much more about that than myself. And you can see then the aerial shot down below. Funnily enough, that's actually one I took. So you can see we're perched right up by the cliff face. Yeah, we're in nice sort of rural surroundings. And you can see the start of the runway just above the end of the groundwork site there. And that's looking, the site runs due north. So you can see away off towards the North Sea. And one of the reasons it was built there as well was obviously ease of access, because the airport, like I say, is just 50 meters to the left of the facility, so it's very close by. The other reason, sorry, that I should have touched on as well, NDA recognised that Dunray, which is 25 miles from site, is decommissioning. So there are going to be, over the next few years, a large kind of decrease in jobs in the north of Scotland. And Wick is actually recognised to be quite an impoverished area since the rundown of the herring industry, because it was a booming fishing town a couple of decades ago now. So from a socio-economic perspective, they decided that Wick would be a good fit in terms of actually giving jobs back to the community, as well as all the environmental factors that I mentioned previously, that it would be a good location to store facilities such as this. And certainly the socio-economic benefits, I think, they've grown a bit greater than they could have imagined, because the facility was initially designed to hold about 30 staff. And obviously, due to the identification of sift and lift requirements and digitization projects and all the rest of it, we're actually up to 70 staff. So we are now at the stage where we're not only going to have to build extensions for storage, we're also going to have to build extensions for office space as well. So I'm actually at the stage where I'm currently speaking to contractors just now to look at proposals for adding extensions to the rear of the facility with additional office space, just to fit in our extra staff and keep it all socially distanced, because obviously we're now in a pandemic and coronavirus world where things are probably never going to go quite back to what they were. So we want to make sure that our staff have got a nice, spacious kind of work environments in the future. You'll have seen from the earlier picture, it's quite a unique and imposing and stunning looking facility, to be fair. So we've actually won several architectural awards shortly after opening. I mean, it's a facility that everybody should see. It really is. It's quite a stunning bit of design. I mean, obviously it's not without its problems. There's maybe sometimes there's been a bit of form over function. I think obviously if some people with maybe more operational backgrounds have been involved in the early days, we might have got some things differently. But all in all, the facility does work well for what we need it to do. So we've just got an image here. So we've actually got, like I said earlier, the complication from the site is the fact that it's a secure nuclear record storage facility, but part of the requirement is public access. So in here, you've got a very early shot of our reception. This is actually back before we come into the facility. But you can see it's nice, kind of open, clean lines. And obviously we'd have receptionists there at that front desk as you come in. So it's quite a pleasant kind of environment to walk into for members of the public. On to the next stage. So we've got a community room that you see there in shot. So we actually hold, well, obviously not now with coronavirus, but we have held quite a lot of workshops and varying on all things. We have like Dunray Women's group come and use us. We have the local heritage groups come and use us, local council, emergency services departments come and do training on site as well. So the community facility actually serves a range of purposes, and it's heavily used. And obviously it's just a shame at the moment that we've been closed to public now for almost an entire calendar year actually, and probably will be for another 10 to 11 months, I'd imagine as well. But we have all right manner of engagement programs that run through the public facing front ends, the Cadence archive. So that's actually managed by another subcontractor of us, which is Highlife Highland. And they put out displays, as you can see here in the display boards on the side. They have groups down in their public search area. We get a lot of interaction with a core group of volunteers who come in. And they just they go through the content, the records that we have, and some of them do specific projects on, like for example, there's one man who translates out the Wick Harbour Trust diaries, the Harbour Master diaries, and he goes in there, because obviously old writing can be quite difficult to read. He translates them all back out and gets them all ready for other people to access the information. But again, it's nice, bright and airy. You can see all the pond to the right that I was describing before. And it's just a nice kind of a bright environment, I guess, to access for the public. And this is the public search area that I referred to. So you can see here we've got on one of our events days, we've actually got quite a large number of people in on site at this time. So we generally try and get some stuff out to display. At the moment, nearly everything that we do is obviously around the Cadence archive. And as Gordon mentioned in his presentation, we are at the stage now where we're starting to review documentation from the nuclear side, and hopefully we can start to get more of a nuclear connection to what we're actually offering in terms of outreach. So we can actually hopefully get some nuclear enthusiasts and perhaps scientists, etc., coming in to actually do research on site when they can access material. We're getting ever closer to that, which is really good. So like I said earlier, we have 8 repositories on site for holding information. We've got 5 of them are all standard size, kitted out the same way. And then we've got some smaller ones, and then we've got a dedicated repository, which is for the visual archive collection, which is audiovisual material. So each of these is obviously what you're seeing in front of you there is just a mobile racking. So they just wind back and forth and allow you access to the shelving. As Gordon mentioned as well, we're very close to capacity. So this is an old photo before we had anything in. We've actually got around about 52.5 linear kilometers of storage across all 8 of these repositories. Roughly equates to over 220,000 1.4 cubic feet boxes being able to be stored. So it just shows you the extent that we've actually almost filled up now. We moved from Harwell, which is way down near Oxford. We took up a collection of 26,000 boxes, and from Dunray we moved in 22,000 boxes. Obviously Dunray was a lot easier, it's only 25 miles from us, so that was quite straightforward. The problems arisen is that, and obviously this is new, I'm not an archivist by any stretch, so when I entered this sector, I couldn't believe quite how many different sizes of boxes there are. I kept getting asked to try and come up with calculations for when we'd fill, and it's like, well, if it was based on one size of box, it'd been quite straightforward, but I've seen every size of box known to man, and I can't quite believe how many varieties there are, so it's tricky to figure out when we will fill up, but I think that was the problem maybe with the initial spec-in of the shelving and stuff. It's I don't think they were quite aware of how many different boxes were out there in the world. But like I say, we're getting there. We're actually doing a reboxing exercise. We're doing a lot of sifting left, trying to establish what should be kept, and then tied with that now, because of the realization of how many boxes and how many different sizes of boxes, we're actually moving into the world of digitization. So we're actually going to try and digitize a lot of the content instead of keep physical copies, and that'll be for like shorter retention records, say 10, 20 years. And you'll also see there the repositories are all, the shelving is very high, so we've actually got mobile elevated work platforms for the staff to get in and access the higher shelving, and that's all done by a dedicated warehouse team that we have on site. So all the repositories that we've got, they're linked up to a BMS, which is obviously a building management system. So all the repositories are fully automated with environmental controls, and a constant temperature humidity is maintained at all times. Like I said, one of the reasons it was built where it was is our external temperatures don't vary massively either. Because we're close to the North Sea and the Pentland Firth, and we've got the Atlantic, we don't get as cold as other areas do. So we've generally got quite a consistently mild, albeit for us, frustrating temperature, where generally it's just mostly windy and a bit wet, and the temperature doesn't fluctuate massively. On a good day, we might get into the mid-20s. On a bad day, we're rarely much lower than 0 degrees, to be honest. I said already, we've got 8 repositories of various sizes, and one's dedicated to video and film archive. And we access those higher shelves with mobile elevated work platforms. And we've got, like I say, one of our teams is dedicated to actual retrievals of documentation. That's the warehouse team on site. All the records have to be physically transported to WIC. So that's one of the massive issues we've had. So when Gordon was mentioning that really the archive could be anywhere because of modern technology, the fact that it's in WIC obviously still leads to problems in terms of getting everything from that map earlier that you'd seen. Only Dunray is close to us. All the rest are a long, long way from us. So there's both a operational, logistical problem and also a security issue with that, because some of these records are they're controlled information. They have security restrictions on them. Trying to get them to us in one kind of move, it can be tricky, especially when the route can obviously be impacted by weather. During winter, we've had some problems where maybe vehicles have had to be rerouted. We've maybe had to cancel proposed deliveries. Some vehicles have had to turn back just due to road conditions further up ahead of them. So it's by no means it's an easy easy job getting everything to us. But like I say, we did manage to empty Harwell, get it up, and we're currently going through taking some records from some of the Magnox sites. So that's predominantly been Oldbury, and the Welsh one that Gordon would say better than me, but I think it's Transwyfyd. There's not enough vowels in their names. Yeah, we've managed to get some of the records up from there, and Sellafield's an ongoing process as well, getting records up from Cumbria. So, but yeah, it's not without its complications, that's for sure. So contractually, as I said, Restore Digital managed the facility on behalf of the NDA. So one of the contractual requirements the NDA imposed on Restore was that we had to have certain ISO standards for managing the facility. So on site now, we currently hold ISO standards 9001 for quality, 14001 for environment, 45001 for health and safety, 27001 for information security, and 22301 for business continuity. So we've had all of those since around about circa 2017, and we've actually been reassessed on them, and we keep getting our certification. We've got a very robust management system in place. I'm lucky I've got a really, really good team, Gordon being one of them, and they just help to make sure that everything kind of flows. And we've had a really good document control system in place since day one, which does make our lives much easier as well. We've had place of deposit status that's granted by the National Archives, and then more recent than that, we got archive service accreditation. Those were both things that Gordon, in his position as head archivist, were heavily involved with. And then in the early days of me taking over the site, we ended up having to do some presentations and some visits with the regulators to make sure that Nucleus, the procedures we had in place and the security requirements were all up to scratch. So the ONR, which is the Office of Nuclear Regulators, they actually came and inspected site and obviously gave us the green light to hold some of the nature of information, which is obviously highest level of classification. They're quite happy with the robust procedures and systems we've got in place. And obviously the environmental agencies, SEPA and EA, they also approved and decided that they can get the records into the facility. Oh, okay, so I think that's everything for me. So I guess we open it back to questions from the floor, and I'll stop sharing my screen now.
So far I've not seen any questions in the chat, but do please feel free to unmute yourselves and ask questions directly from Chris and Gordon. And while you're gathering your thoughts, I'll be sitting here trying to recover from building envy. An absolutely gorgeous facility.
That is nice. Yeah, it's definitely. I spent about 12 years working in some rather ropey ships at sea at times, and it's a very different environment for me. So, yeah.
I've worked on land that's felt like a ropey ship at sea at times.
Yeah.
I suppose I would say as well that if people go away and they've got any questions when they think about it in retrospect, by all means, please drop me an email. Feel free to get in touch, and if I can answer any questions going forward, I'll be very happy to.
Yeah, and if you can't easily get a hold of your emails, they can contact us at the DLM forum and we'll forward them on.
Thank you.
Yeah, we have got a question from Janet Anderson. What standards are you using for your digital archive?
In terms of Nucleus, as I mentioned, we're just at the process where we're starting to put those standards in place. And I think I'll say, if you come back to us in about 6 months' time, we might have some more constructive answers. At the moment, we know what the questions are we're asking, but we don't have the answers yet.
Well, I know that we are, in terms of the scanning project, digitization, we're looking at, we're going to get 10,000, I think it's 10,001, Gordon, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're going to have ISO 10001, and that accreditation will be tied in with everything else that we do. But as Gordon said, it's early days, and I don't know enough about digitization to certainly get involved in answering that one.
Yeah, I wasn't so much thinking of the digitization side. I was thinking of actually when you create your digital archive itself. So when you've got your digitized material, at the same time you need to work out how you're going to create your digital archive. Of course, I have an interest in this, as does the DLM. We have the e-archiving building block and the e-arch standards. So please feel free to ask.
Thank
This
you.
is something we've worked on since 2013, and we've got standards across Europe. And we haven't got John with us today, John Sheridan, but he's well aware of the digital archive standards that we've got.
Thank you very much, and I'm sure we'll take you up on that.
Yeah.
You're welcome. Good talk, both of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Any more questions, or can we free our speakers to go back to whatever they're doing with the rest of their days? Well, in that case, it only remains to me to say thank you very much for a very illuminating and interesting presentation.
David,
Oh, sorry.
David, someone is trying to ask something.
Okay.
Yes, hello. I work for the commission at DG Ener. So for energy, first I wanted to really thank you, to say a big thank you, because it was very illuminating. It was very useful.
Oh.
I think that I am very happy that it is recorded, because I will see it again, and I will put. I have already put your site on my favorites. I wanted to ask you, because I work with the semi-current records now, and I have the opinion that we overprotect our information. And I would like to know if you can give me some hints to convince our actual manager of the intermediate archives in our part to this openness to the public, what it is useful afterwards for, what is the kind of information that they request, and this part of the of a public exchange with this kind of records, because I think that it is always easier to protect everything and then afterwards keep it for our own. But I was very impressed of all the actions that you are doing with the universities and with the public, which I think that it is very important, and it should we should also be aware of that. So if you have any inspiration to provide us, I will be happy to hear. And thank you again.
I don't know that I've got inspiration for you. I suppose it's very interesting with the nuclear industry, because again, as Chris touched on with the building, there is always a tension between making things available and keeping things private that need to be kept private. And we are fortunate in that the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority are taking the view that unless something must be secret, unless something must be kept closed, it should be open. And partly that's governed by just government security classification. So a record will tell us if it's classified. But it's also the case, I think, that there is a lot of, because the industry is not open, or has not always been open in the past, it gives an opportunity for people to be suspicious or for conspiracy theories. So the more information you can put out there, the more transparent you can be, the more trust you will get, I think. You know, that there are, I've done a presentation like this one where there was a gentleman who was almost the fact that we were destroying records meant that we were keeping secrets. So you can't please everybody, you just can't. And I think the thing to do is to say, you'll get a lot more goodwill if you're open and transparent about what you're trying to do. And then you'll get more trust on the few things that you have to keep secret. But if you start off by saying that everything is secret, everything will look like a conspiracy. I would also say that we are governed by the Freedom of Information Act, which I think has really been the game changer on a lot of this, because the Freedom of Information Act effectively says if someone wants to look at something, they have the right to look at it unless you can prove otherwise. So even if we've got a record which is closed because it says it's secret, if somebody asks to look at it, we have to have somebody review it to say, yes, that cannot be released, or that must remain secret. So the culture is very much around openness, unless there's a very good reason not to.
I think, Gordon, sorry, I'll say as well, you make a good point there. In fact, the reviewing process. So if you wanted to kind of put any concerns to bed on both fronts. Obviously, getting subject matter experts to review the documentation is key, because that will allay any fears that your own department has, as well as allay any fears that the public have, they can't access information. It helps kind of refine the process, and obviously lessens liability, because they will be the experts on the information that you're trying to open up, I guess.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. And as I say, if you've got any follow-up questions, please do get in touch.
Thanks.
Any more? No, shaking his head. Well, in that case, excuse me, in that case, this really is my opportunity to thank you very much for some illuminating presentations and to wish you well with the rest of your day. I noticed that there's a link up in the chat for the standards that Janet was talking about, so perhaps you want to refer to those. And thank you all, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the next event of this kind.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thanks so much.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.